On October the 4th, a massive coalition of nations led by predominantly China, but also Russia, including also Tier 2 and Tier 3 powers, with China the predominant world superpower and Russia also a Tier 1 power, but not quite China-sized. These enormous invasion forces consisting of not just the Chinese and Russians, but of course also second-tier powers like Iran, as well as also Pakistan, a staunch Chinese ally who would effectively be staying with China for the long haul, including after the invasion well into the occupation phase, as Pakistan, even as a Tier 2 power, was a very large and heavily armed nation in terms of their military capacity, as the other nations were also included in the Foreign Expeditionary Army, as it was called, in effect, which was the combination of 500,000 troops from the other coalition partners, which even included Tier 3 nations like the Venezuelan forces, who would participate in the fighting that was now also concurrently unfolding in the San Antonio battle space within the South Central Invasion Sector. Even a small Nicaraguan combat battalion, armed and equipped by the Chinese and Russians, would also partake in the fighting in San Antonio, along with even a Serbian army brigade contributed to this effort as well. These aforementioned forces, the Venezuelans, the Nicaraguans, and the Serbian forces, all attached to the Russians within the scope of the San Antonio battle, as Russia was the second largest contributor of forces after the Chinese. They contributed significantly to the air armada, naval forces, and also even relatively large ground forces to the operation as a whole, as the Russians operated throughout South and Central Texas, and even in the Santa Fe area and Lower Colorado, were heavily bolstered by not just the Chinese PLA forces of their army, whether it was their active, reserve, or ready reserve components, but also they were assisted by the fanatical People's Armed Police, paramilitary shock forces of China, as these forces were effectively a Praetorian Guard-like element of the CCP regime, and would carry out all of their orders with great fanaticism and to the letter. These were the true believers in the party, as these paramilitary forces would play a massive role in the operation in conjunction with the PLA ground forces or the PLA army. There were also even People's Liberation Army naval forces, which included 2 out of their 6 PLAN Marine brigades, which were operating in the South Central Invasion Sector and would conduct amphibious landings, both in the Houston area and the Beaumont/Port Arthur area. These PLAN forces were very capable and powerful combined arms forces, which were effectively self-contained units in their own right and were highly combat-capable forces and were the perfect fit for the operations as they were now unfolding along the coast. Deeper inland in the South Central Invasion Sector, of course, was the occurring battle unfolding in the DFW Metroplex, as the previous installation had laid out the conditions of the fighting occurring in the Pleasant Grove and Balch Springs area, as this had become a deadly pocket created by the arrival of a combat engineer battalion, both to secure a segment of I-635 within their area of operations, but also to clear the flanks, as flank clearance operations were absolutely vital to the success of the capture and or destruction of other key objectives. In this local area, as there would be many logistical trains, so to speak, traveling through the area, which was in effect a group of soft-skinned vehicles which would carry in the supplies for the combat units, the clearance of the flanks for operations deeper in the city, including the major operation for the capture and securing intact of the downtown of Dallas, as well as also the destruction of the 2nd of the 198th and American Armored Battalion in the area, as well as also the destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd and simultaneous destruction of the Raytheon facility, which they were guarding. As a mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th Infantry Division had to make a relatively lengthy trip deep into the city and even clear their own flanks en route, along with another combat engineer battalion moving into the area to assist them in this endeavor. The flanks again had to be cleared around these major operations in order for them to be pulled off with a high degree of success, due to the need for logistics being transported from the CCP regime properties, which were again strategically purchased as close as possible to all the objectives in order to make this operation run as smooth as possible. Although it was not always possible to purchase these properties immediately adjacent to objectives, which was sometimes actually the case, the other properties upon which many of these major units sat were still close enough to their objectives that they were within mere miles of them, and the routes for logistics and later for troop transport around this node, which was the DFW metro area, which needed to be fully brought under control by these Trojan shock forces according to fourth generation warfare, needed to be secured for their ease of logistics and troop transport. And thus, these clusters of armed reactionary civilians, as they appeared, needed to be eradicated as quickly as humanly possible. They were not to be permitted to grow into any type of threat to the flanks, as in the transport of logistics and troops for the major combat forces that were operating deep in the node, or in this metro area. As this area, Pleasant Grove, and also Balch Springs had been surrounded. Originally, it was a 3-mile north-south by 4-mile east-west area, as the combat engineers had plowed their way in through all of the rubble cascading into the streets, as well as abandoned and destroyed vehicles that littered the streets everywhere. They're very capable engineering vehicles in the form of the GCZ-115s with their plows and their arms, which could manipulate and move rubble and or other obstacles, including earth, and also even construct obstacles, as these combat engineers were a very versatile force. They also had, in each combat company, one platoon which boasted a mine clearance vehicle, which was the GSL-130, which could fire a rocket-guided, line-clearing plastic explosive charge to clear paths through minefields or destroy enemy obstacles and unfortunate personnel that happened to be in the path of these devastating line charges. Of course, this one was of the PLA and Marines in this image, although for the combat engineers of the PLA, it would have been painted in their colors. As we go to the operation at hand, as the previous installation had effectively laid out the conditions of the operation as it was unfolding in this area, the cordon companies, 5 of 7 combat companies, plus the headquarters and support company, had cordoned off this area, with the 2 other combat companies sitting back for security and or reserve purposes to be sent in as reserves if needed. These forces also guarded the headquarters and support company over the battalion as they sat outside of this cordon. In the east sat 1 company near I-635, the segment that was to be secured. In the north, there were 2 cordoning companies moving into the area, and in the west, there was a cordon company, and in the south, just off this map, below this residential area here was yet the fifth and final cordon company, as again, the other two combat companies sat a bit away from this operation, as the cordon of the area had shrunk from a 4-mile east-west and 3-mile north-south to a 2-mile east-west by 1-mile north-south area, as the enormous 300 millimeter rocket bombardment, which had come in initially from the PHLO-3 battalion as one of its firing batteries had lobbed massive salvos of these highly devastating rockets into this part of the city. They had effectively annihilated tens of thousands of non-combatants, as is normally the case in these situations, as well as also in excess of 1,000 armed combatants, as initially the number of armed reactionary civilians in this pocket was approximately 2,500 and had shrunk to approximately 800, as these were they who had taken cover in the drainage and sewer systems in the area, as well as some of the more robust buildings which could take extensive punishment from this type of barrage. As they hid on the lower or basement levels of some of these buildings, they would emerge to find that the combat engineers were now thoroughly saturating their area upon which they had originally emerged, as they had come out of this mixed residential and industrial area, emerging from their places of residence with arms in hand and only carrying what they could carry on their person. Effectively, at this point in time, the armed reactionary civilians had no effective command and control, as again, communications were effectively totally hampered to the point to where the only communications abilities available were line of sight and earshot communications, or the use of runners, as runners spreading messages would effectively be at high risk for elimination in the intensity of this type of combat. These spreading of messages over relatively longer distances were often unsuccessful and failed miserably, as again, the logistics were perhaps the largest issue of all affecting the armed reactionary civilian elements, as they utilized a wide array of different small arms types and calibers, and again could usually only carry initially on them what they could effectively handle as far as weight on their person, as carrying large quantities of ammo was very cumbersome and tiring. Many armed reactionary civilians would run out of ammunition when engaging the coalition forces within combat situations. Although there would be small successes nonetheless, even despite being thrown back into the Stone Age with the tandem anti-SAT cyber strikes and the local use of electronic warfare assets on these forces, they would still, in some instances, plan clever ambushes on small groupings of PLA troops conducting patrols, utilizing certain types of implements which were improvised, which could be placed in ambush positions, and these forces could emerge from nearby manhole covers and take the equipment off of the deceased PLA troops. Before reinforcements could arrive, they could disappear underground. Again, these instances were exceedingly rare, but did happen. Although this early in the invasion, such instances were not common whatsoever at all, and would not occur until many hours into the invasion, as in this instance, as 800 armed reactionary civilians were emerging from the various manhole covers in the area and were now taking positions in the former rubbled residences of these residential areas, as well as also in some of the industrial areas. The cordoning PLA combat engineer forces would dismount their 3 combat platoons on this western cordon to sweep through the area and engage and destroy these forces. And they would utilize and press all their advantages to the maximum, which included utilizing their armed combat robots, which they had settled on the use of quad-legged robots as they had more dexterity than bipedal robots or two-legged robots. They also utilized hundreds of disposable DJI track-based 4 pounds of demolition charge or C4 equipped robots, which could be easily driven into fortified locations or rubbled husks of buildings and detonated to collapse what remained of these structures or simply eliminate groupings of enemy personnel spotted by their quadcopter ISR assets or even higher altitude assets such as their high altitude armed recon drone in the area, the CH-4A, or others, as well as also satellite-based, which all overlaid to provide a complete three-dimensional battlefield view of the operation as it progressed, as all enemy and allied personnel would be placed on the combat data links as they existed, and as they were eliminated would be removed from the combat data links, which assisted not only in seeing where all enemy activity was according to the massive fleets of the quadcopter battlefield recon drones, mixed with the high-altitude drone capabilities, mixed with also the satellite-based capabilities, but also assisted in communications capabilities between the different units, in addition to also radio, as these forces would highly cooperate and coordinate their actions together. Many occurrences on this battlefield would be happening at or around the same time, as these different platoons from these different combat companies all swept through their sub-AOs or subordinate areas of operations within the larger AO or area of operation as a whole, as the Eastern Cordon Company, now having had plowed their way onto this street through the rubble-choked areas just to the south, were now aligned parallel to their segment of I-635 upon which they were to control, as they had their CH-901A loitering munitions equipped with fragmentation warheads, which were plenty of payload to deal with soft-skinned vehicles, whether civilian or military. These patrolled this highway as there were armed reactionary civilian technicals or trucks or SUVs or even personal cars that had armed men inside of them, as well as also a Wing-Loon 2 dedicated combat drone equipped with anti-tank guided missiles, including the very powerful CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-ship anti-tank missile, which could penetrate battleship armor, as these missiles were also ideal when using them against rubble dug-in positions, which, like these destroyed residential buildings, would see armed civilians taking cover within them and being fired at by these Wing-Loon 2 dedicated combat drones to smash their positions, including at the rail station, as this Wing-Loon 2 dedicated combat drone is firing 8 of its payload of 12 total missiles at these forces in the DART rail station, or the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Station. This was the mauve color coding for passenger rail, and this brown color coding is for freight rail, as there were freight rail lines that passed through this quasi-industrial / residential area. The former factory buildings, as these were smaller in scale than, say, the metal fabrication plant that was across the tributary from this part of Pleasant Grove in Balch Springs, the glass factory was a bit larger, and it took the punishment of the 300mm rocket strikes somewhat well, although very little bit of the roofs were even remaining, or the building facades on the sides, barely being held up by steel girders and other crumbling parts of the edifice. The areas here would also have to be cleared by the combat engineers, and again, they would utilize their demolition robots, their disposable demolition robots, to the maximum, as they preferred using these, as when they were restocked during logistical resupply operations, they could acquire these just about as fast as they used them, as on the other hand, they also had quad-legged robots with arms for planting or removing demolitions, as well as also obstacles, but preferred to save these, as these were slightly more difficult to repair if damaged or replace if destroyed. Although they could be replaced somewhat easily, the Disposable, smaller track-based DJI drones were even more readily available and even faster to resupply, and thus these would be used in massive amounts by these different combat engineer companies as they had cordoned or surrounded, enveloped this entire area, and were now clearing it rubble pile to rubble pile, building husk to building husk, destroyed factory compound to destroyed factory compound. In this area, as the metal fabrication plant's largest building in the south would even be hit by a JH-7 strike, as one of these potent strike aircraft would fly in and jettison 4,000 pounds of high explosive upon what remained of this facility, annihilating most of the personnel inside, leaving the rest effectively to be mopped up by 3 squads and 5 combat robots, with 2 squads coming from the middle platoon and 1 squad coming from the northernmost platoon, with 2 other squads tactically bounding and covering outside of these 2 buildings, as this was where most of the metal fabrication activities occurred, and this was more of a storage area of the complex, and this was the office, as they would bound and cover tactically to assault the office with FPV drone support, assaulting these 12 personnel that were therein, as well as combat robots from one of the 2 northernmost cordon companies, as there were 2 companies in the north that had snaked through this area effectively, with another one just off the map, with its lead platoon seizing control of this crossing point and dispatching their 5 squads of their platoon to clear this former industrial site. As this was a smaller factory complex along the rail line, it was occupied by approximately 15 personnel. They would also use their 5 from the company just off map in the north. They would use their 5 combat robots to assist in the assault in a tactical L vector of fire, as well as also then send them on to engage these personnel by the bridge and seize control of the bridge, and then even utilize them to provide support to this platoon's forces, of the northernmost platoon of the West Cordon Company of Combat Engineers, to sweep this area of residential buildings that had been horribly mauled by the mass 300mm rocket artillery barrage, as the PHLO-3s were very powerful artillery systems and were the most powerful systems employed by the 59th Group Army's 19th Artillery Brigade, as they also boasted their 152mm howitzers in 2 battalions, and they had 2 battalions of their 155mm howitzers, which were the PLL-01s, as the 152s were the PLL-66s. These PLL-01s would see plenty of use during the overall operations in the DFW area, along with the PLL-66s, but there would even be the use of a single WS-35R rocket-assisted 155mm projectile, which would be fired to finish off some of the last remaining armed reactionary civilians taking cover in the rubble at the maximum extent of its range, as this was considered the longest range and most accurate artillery shell in the world, as it was Baidu or satellite guided, and it had a range of nearly 40 miles. The PLL-01 battalion, firing from this grouping of battalions from the 19th, as again there was a PLL-66, PHLO-3, and PLL-01 battalion, would fire at the maximum extent of their range and hit targets hiding in this residential area, namely at their final redoubt in this area, as many would retreat into this particular city block, as again, the combat engineers were fighting rubble pile to rubble pile, building husk to building husk, as these forces moved through the area and deployed their ground troops from their vehicles, along with their very potent robotic capabilities, as these boasted a 12.7mm heavy machine gun. These were very small and nimble heavy fire support platforms that could move along with the advancing squads of PLA troops, who also had massive support from their loitering munitions, i.e. their CH-901As, as well as also, again, from FPV drones, from their FPV drone operators within each headquarters platoon of each combat company, as each headquarters platoon had 4 of these FPV drone operators, which could operate these devastating drones and fly them into groupings of enemy personnel or vehicles. And again, the combat here would be savage, as these combat engineers fought street to street, alley to alley, rubble pile to rubble pile, building husk to building husk, to seize control of this area and completely flush out any and all armed resistance with extreme prejudice, as again, buildups along the flanks of vital logistical routes could never be accepted or tolerated by the PLA forces, as the major operations unfolding in other parts of the Metroplex made it imperative that any and all armed resistance on the flanks be abruptly crushed. Again, the PLA forces were extremely flexible due to their maximum dominance in the ISR, AI, and information technology spheres, as this enabled these forces to be more flexible than was ever before possible, making some of their movements and decisions capable in minutes, as opposed to previously where it would take hours or sometimes days to conduct certain types of operations. As these forces of this battalion of combat engineers from the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade surrounded and enveloped this area, they would flush it out and be very diligent in their methods of so doing, utilizing, again, all of their advantages, not only in their AI, IT, and ISR capabilities, but using these to maximize the effectiveness of their robotic firepower, vehicle firepower, and squad-based firepower, along with their drone support from above. And all of these capabilities combining made these combat engineers a quasi-elite, highly technologically advanced, and very devastating force as they dispatched their platoons. This platoon in the north from this grouping of vehicles, this was their platoon vehicles, consisting of a GCC-115 armored engineering vehicle, consisting also of their infantry fighting vehicle per platoon, which was their ZBDO-4A, which boasted extreme firepower in the form of a 30mm autocannon, 100mm main gun, 2 HJ-09 ATGMs, which were quite well-ranged and potent ATGM systems, as well as even a 7.62x54 coaxial weapon for firing at enemy personnel getting close to the vehicles, as they also had their 3 armor personnel carriers, or Type 89As, equipped with their heavy machine guns. These forces, with their vehicle-based firepower, were already highly capable and destructive forces. When integrated with their drone and robotic capabilities, they became even more so, as especially using their demolition robots to the maximum, as this indicates the C4 means that the track-based DJI 4-pound of C4 apiece demolition robots were used in this particular structure to destroy the personnel inside before the squads from this other platoon assaulted the building, as they had fire support from across the tracks, as these 5 squads would bound between the tracks, take cover, lay down fire, enabling these two squads from this middle platoon, not the southern platoon here, but the middle platoon, to bound and cover tactically towards this building and eventually rush into the building after the C4 had been utilized to great effect and eliminate the remaining personnel out of this original 45 number before continuing on as 2 squads to this location, as they would bound to this street and lay down in the prone position to take cover, as these 5 squads, upon the clearance of this building occurring, would all bound and cover tactically to assault this building, utilizing, again, their demolition robots inside this building to clear any personnel from within before they rushed in to effectively mop up, as these 50 personnel would be hit heavily by these track-based demolition robots, which were highly nimble and mobile, as even if they flipped over, because they had dual tracks on either side, they could technically not really be stopped, as they could navigate obstacles with ease and enter fortified strong points or rubble piles and demolish their opponents inside, and even send what remained of these facades crumbling to the ground as they would pancake in on themselves. As this was occurring in the north, as this glass factory was under assault, both the main building and the annex along the tracks, this platoon, again, would support the advance of these two squads from the middle platoon, while the middle squad here of this middle platoon would take position according to standard building clearance procedures outside of the glass factory in a wedge and along the tracks, as the track mound would provide some cover against the armed civilian forces taking refuge on this city block of former residential areas, and they would trade fire, preventing these forces from reinforcing those in the glass factory and those in the glass factory from escaping as these two squads were moving through, clearing it. As all of that was occurring in this area, a Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drone at the opening of the map has fired 4 CM-502KG anti-ship, anti-tank missiles at these former rubbled residential areas that slammed into them and wiped out these personnel alongside of the firepower coming from the advancing squads, as these two squads from the middle platoon in the south had advanced to this rubble pile and were trading fire with these personnel initially before these missiles had effectively come in, as by the time these squads had reached this point, the CM-502KGs were fired from this Wingloom 2 and smashed into these rubble piles, alongside of fire being traded by these squads, including the squad taking position outside the glass factory according to standard building clearance procedures. As after the main factory building of the glass factory had been cleared, the two clearing squads would advance to this position and wait outside of this building. As this building was still being cleared, these 5 squads had then taken position outside to the north as the squad was in the south, and then they bounded and captured this building, what remained of it, after driving C4 demolition robots into it, while these two squads had taken position outside of the building, again according to standard buildings clearance procedures. This one of 2 squads in the north would seize control of the tributary, and including this crossing point, using their vehicle's field of fire of their lead vehicle to control this area, while they dispatched their 5 squads of their platoon to take control of this bridge and also clear this building with the other 4 squads, while also using their armed combat robots to assist in L-vectored fire against the 15 personnel hiding in this smashed small industrial site that was along the tributary and also the railroad tracks and this road just off property to the north, as this was a parking area here. As the armed robots assisted these 4 squads in eliminating the personnel in this building and then moving in to ensure the building was clear, they then would move out and seize control of this bridge, firing at these personnel, trading fire with them as these personnel on this side of the tributary by the railroad bridge were exchanging fire with the armed combat robots as all 5 of them moved through the area and traded fire in return. Guided through the ISR network and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, this firefight was over nearly as soon as it began. As of course, as these forces moved into the area, they would be pummeled ruthlessly by these CH-901A loitering munitions coming in to strike them. To aid in these 5 squads, having had freshly cleared the glass factory annex building, to bound over the tracks and into the residential neighborhood, and then being joined by the armed combat robots having seized this crossing point and eliminated these personnel as Wingloom 2 strikes had been fired into this area, hitting these personnel and wiping them out, as also other Wingloom 2 strikes of their CM-502KGs hit this rubble pile and wiped these personnel out here and here. As these armed combat robots moved through the area, again, they were joined by the 5 PLA squads, who would then move into this city block and take up position along this rubble pile. All 5 squads would spread out and control all areas of approach in this rubble pile. And then the armed combat robots would continue on to where this manhole cover was, as all of these manhole covers are essentially where all the armed reactionary civilians have materialized from that had successfully hid from the 300mm rocket strikes, as they rapidly found hiding places, although many hundreds of their compatriots were not so lucky, nor were the residents that were non-combatants that had been struck in these devastating rocket strikes that simply smashed and pulverized this area into complete and total rubbled ruination, dust, and cascading building supplies, and destroyed vehicles in the streets that were ultimately navigated successfully by the combat engineers, with their very potent engineering vehicles, including even initially some of their GSL 130s having had destroyed rubble piles in the streets with their rocket-guided line clearance charges, as they also had a plow, just as did the GCZ 115s. And of course, the GCZ 115 had its arm that it could manipulate rubble piles as well as earth and other obstacles and simply tear it down or build their own obstacles. Again, the combat engineers could do both, as they were a versatile fighting force. As all of these forces moved through the area, they simply slaughtered all in their wake, as nobody, in effect, was prepared for the onslaught that had struck them, as these combat engineers were heavily armed, not only with their vehicles, robots, combat drones, and more, but also with their powerful air support, as again, a JH-7 strike, which was absolutely devastating on the southern building of a metal fabrication plant, had annihilated most of the 200 enemy personnel inside before the assaulting squads, both here in the south and this one in the north here, along with their 5 combat robots, 2 here and 3 here, moving into the building to clear it, would send in C4 demolition robots to effectively collapse what remained of the ceiling into the building before they then moved in and combed the rubble for any survivors, which they would find effectively very few. As again, when they entered this massive structure, they took some fire even after the use of the C4, but they would quickly dispatch those who had opened fire on them as they breached the building, including the armed combat robots. Although in the north, as the armed combat robots from the North Cordon Company, one of 2, as again the other was slightly off map, cordoning this area, they would deploy their 5 armed robots, 2 to penetrate this building from the northwest, and these 2 squads bounding and covering tactically to enter from the east. As the vehicles took fire from this northern building, as there were originally 80 personnel inside, these squads would drive in their C4 demolition robots and demolish some of these enemy personnel, although some would still survive to try to return fire at the armed combat robots and troops as they made entry as they breached the building. According to standard building clearance procedures, these 2 squads outside from this northernmost platoon of this Cordon Company, having moved under the highway, would bound and cover outside of the building, not only as per proper building clearance procedures on either side of the building, but also gradually bounding and covering towards the 12 personnel in this building, trying to desperately hold out in this rubbled office building. As this armed combat robot tried to assault it from the north, it would end up being hit by a Molotov cocktail, which would destroy this robot, as they would lose 1 of their 5 robots from this company of their armed robots. These other 2 would gradually move, exchanging fire until they got to this point in the south, and then they would fire in the building from this area to support the bounding and covering troops heading toward the building as a distraction from this side, and an L vector of fire as well, and then would hold their fire as this squad would breach the building while this squad would wait outside. As initially, before these robots had even moved through this area, fire was being exchanged between these forces and this squad here of this platoon that had been dismounted into this city block, and this platoon of this Northern Cordon Company into this city block with the last platoon still mounted in their vehicles. Fire had been exchanged to prevent escape from these personnel in the west, to the west, and as the robots moved, of course, they held their fire and allowed this maneuver to occur to allow for this building clearance operation to unfold with a high degree of tactical brilliance. As, of course, even as this was occurring, 2 FPV drones from the FPV drone operators forward deployed from the headquarters platoon off map were flying FPV drones throughout this area, including 2 to support the squads assaulting the metal fabrication plant as a whole, flying 2 into this building. Although the building was rubbled and in ruins, these FPV drones only managed to wipe out several of the personnel hiding amid the rubble. Although they were somewhat effective, it took a combination of the armed robots and 2 squads assaulting the building to finally clear it. as the C4 demolition robots were mostly used on the southern and northern building by these forces, they did immense damage to the large numbers of troops inside, along with the JH-7 airstrike on the southern building, while these squads were safely away before they had advanced towards what remained of what was left of the building. These two squads from this platoon in the middle would eventually assault the building, with the one squad here from the middle, or from the northernmost platoon, and the 5 armed robots that were moving in to assist in the clearance of the building with the troops, after again they had driven in demolition disposable DJI robots to demolish any survivors they could find in this large structure that was already smashed to the ground, as there was very little that remained after the rocket strike to begin with, by the 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. As again, there were still areas of the building where small, tiny groups of survivors had made it that would exchange fire with those that breached the building, including the armed robots. They would be quickly dispatched for a loss of no PLA troops and no robots that assaulted this building, as again, very few survived the airstrike and C4 demolition robots. In the north, very few survived the C4 demolition robots, and the entry on both sides by PLA troops and armed robots. Again, they would only lose one combat robot in this operation, as all of this was occurring at the opening of the map as this building was being assaulted and hit by the airstrike. These armed reactionary civilians running along the bank of the tributary were hit by 2 FPV drones and 2 strikes from fragmentation-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions. As this was going on, fire was being exchanged briefly between these 4 squads of this platoon in the middle, while the 5th squad was bounding to seize control of this crossing point. Eventually, the 4 squads in the north split up for 2 to assault the building, and the other 2 to seize control along the bank to assist in the shrinking cordon around this particular residential area. It has to be kept in mind at all times, as many of these operations in this map were occurring simultaneously or near simultaneously, as all of this was occurring throughout this area against the metal fabrication plant and along the banks. The operations occurring against the glass factory were occurring concurrently, and against this area right here, just to the slight northeast of the tributary, by this 1 platoon out of 3 combat platoons in the headquarters platoon of one of the 2 northern cordon companies, as this was one and the other was mostly off map except for their lead platoon moving into this area. As all of that was going on, the ever-shrinking cordon to the west was unfolding with the clearance of the glass factory, as explained, and the troops preparing to close on the residential area. Again, just off map to the south, as mentioned, there was another company cordoning the south. They, only at the very end, would send one of their platoons from the southern company to hold this area, as this area, again, was shrinking into a smaller cordon, which included this residential area, as at first, these platoons had to fight their way to seize control of the Dart rail station to shrink the area to allow for these troops to flush it out. As also, on this side, the southernmost platoon of the East Cordon Company had taken positions in this rubbled building, as 300mm rockets had struck right in this area, but just far enough away from I-635 that no major damage had been done to the highway infrastructure itself, allowing for the buildings to be destroyed and used as rubbled positions as the forces had plowed their way in of the combat engineers, thus taking position in the rubble and sending one of their 5 squads of their platoon to seize a position along this particular bank of the tributary, while others sat higher up on rubble and could control the entry and exit points by aiming under the highway system to prevent any escapes from this area, as their field of fire would totally cover this area, allowing also for this squad that had moved to seize control of the bridge after a brief engagement with these personnel moving across the southern portion of the tributary. A fight would occur near the bridge, where this squad and the 2 squads on the other side of the tributary would light these personnel up in a X-vector of fire, essentially, while these FPV drones and a loitering munition would hit personnel in this rubble, causing others to retreat deeper into the neighborhood. As these forces from this rubble pile advanced onto this area, they again were supported by strikes from not only FPV drones, but also from C4 being utilized where rubble had spilled between a few taller residential buildings, choking the street, as these armed reactionary civilians were the last to emerge out of the sewer network and take position along the rubble piles on the street, effectively similar to a situation like this. There was a very brief exchange of fire, although ultimately a C4 laden demolition robot had been driven into this pile and demolished, as a number of these personnel had taken position in this area, along with strikes from loitering munitions. As the CM502KG strikes had hit these personnel, along with a brief exchange of fire, these forces then bounded onto the city block. One squad here and two squads here, effectively these three squads of the middle platoon of the West Cordon Company, would advance on and seize control of this city block. As these personnel had all been wiped out, they were no longer a threat in this area, as these 5 squads had moved through here and ultimately took position in this city block. All 5 squads, again, they controlled all entry and exit through this area, and the 5 combat robots continued on, stopping at this manhole cover and laying down fire against the personnel in this area, causing them to retreat ever deeper, as these personnel had already retreated as fighting had broken out after these personnel were destroyed by the tactical movements that occurred by this southernmost platoon of this Cordon Company on the west. They had cleared this area by effectively conducting a pincer with their southernmost squad, and their middle squad, as their northernmost squad, would move through this area here to seize the train station, as the armed combat robots move through to gradually provide support against these personnel. These personnel, again, before moving and eliminating personnel hiding in this rubble, before then moving up and seizing this crossing where the street crossed over the dark rail tracks. While these forces followed behind, they would stop here, allow their armed combat robots to move ahead of them, before then moving and setting up a L formation after these personnel have been destroyed by a combination of Wing Loon 2 fired missiles, as they fired 8 of their payload of 12 ATGMs. 2 missiles would hit this former train station building, leveled to the ground by the massive rocket strikes in the area, along with this former train station building on the other side of the tracks, as these were dual tracks, one moving in the general north and one moving in the general south for the local trains. These missiles hitting these 2 former train station buildings, which were being used as rebel positions, would take out these personnel, while these 4 ATGMs would strike these personnel here. While these others tried to run, they too would be struck after a very brief exchange of fire between this armed combat robot and these personnel to the south on the other side of this former rubble building that was adjacent to the train station, allowing for the armed combat robot to move through the area. Again, very brief exchange of fire before the last person that survived was effectively wiped out, leading to the armed combat robot setting a position as a blocking position along this road as these forces moved into the neighborhood. And then eventually the armed combat robots would move through this area to secure the train station from the northeast, as this squad would move in and hold their positions here after the armed combat robots had swept the area and cleared the way. They would have tactically cleared the way ahead of the advancing squad from the southernmost platoon. As all of this was occurring to secure the train station, with this elaborate movement occurring in this area, after these squads, leaving 2 behind to hold this field of fire, would move through this area and engage these forces using ample numbers of C4-laden DJI demolition robots on these forces, causing many of them to be wiped out, while others would be engaged by direct fire from small arms, ATGMs, Type 69 RPGs, and more, as the armed combat robots, again, earlier having moved through this area, had temporarily assisted in using suppressing fire against these forces, allowing for this squad to then advance and take position here, while the other squad, having taken position in these ruins of this residential area, had aided in cutting these personnel down Well, this squad then moved into position here, allowing for them to then move into position here after, again, heavy use of C4-laden demolition robots to clear the area. And then after that, these squads would tactically bound and cover together, with this squad bounding ahead, taking position here after these missile strikes had long since occurred, allowing for this squad to then bound even further ahead and take position here and get in the prone position and lay down fire, as they would also have assistance from the armed combat robots holding the northeast of the train station, laying down heavy fire on these personnel, wiping many of them out, causing general destruction of this barricade, which was effectively not man-made, but was effectively part of the crumbling edifices of these former buildings into the street, destroying them with demolition robots, again causing the survivors of this group to retreat deeper in, whereupon the WS-35R artillery strike had been called in, as these forces were gradually being pressed away as they were being hit and destroyed as they retreated. As these 5 squads again took position here, 3 squads here, armed robots here, a squad here to block in this area, and this squad from this platoon in the center eventually bounded here after a short-lived engagement with these forces, with strikes coming in from CH-901As into these forces, wiping them out with the fire as these forces fought over this rubble pile after the elimination of these personnel here. This squad would then bound into this area, again, as these forces have been destroyed as they moved into this area, hit by these CH-901As, as the AI target-seeking mode had effectively seen them bounding across the street and running into this area, not giving them a chance to seek cover, hit them and destroyed them immediately in tandem, with this squad laying down heavy fire on them after these forces were first dispatched. As this squad would then afterwards bound into this rubble pile, they would exchange fire with these forces, causing them to bound into this area before they would then do their final bound and lay down a position facing this city block. The city block effectively now surrounded by forces in this area, as these forces again had retreated here. These forces moved further in from the fire coming from these forces. These forces tried to retreat but were destroyed. These forces would move here, these survivors would move into here, these survivors here, these here, ultimately retreating, as again they had retreated into this area, being hit by the long-range 155mm WS-35R Baidu, or satellite-guided shell, which had been fired by a single howitzer from one firing battery of 7 from the one of 2 PLL-01 firing battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, firing at the furthest extent of its range and able to hit these targets in this city block. As they hit these targets and wiped many of these personnel out, effectively eliminating 35 of the remaining 80 personnel, the rest would ultimately surrender, knowing as they were fully surrounded and there was no escape, and the fields of fire completely covered all avenues of escape, including from this direction. They could not flee into the manhole covers at this point in time. There was no means of escape in these former residential buildings, as in there were no underground passages that they could escape to. They could not go into any of these secured manhole covers, and thus would have to surrender, as 35 of the surviving 80 personnel in this particular city block were completely wiped out in the artillery strike, as the ISR and real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed strike had completely caught these forces in the open, the 35 that had been KIA'd in the strike, not to mention others that were horribly maimed and wounded in the strike. The shell, having had flown into the area, had completely wrecked the will of the survivors to even resist any further. And the remaining mostly wounded or horribly maimed survivors would surrender to the PLA Combat Engineer Forces and would receive medical treatment as prisoners of war, as they were now wards of the PLA forces, and were thus treated, for the most part, in accordance with Geneva Conventions, as the PLA observed Geneva Conventions, while the savagely brutal People's Armed Police generally did not, as they made their own rules as they believed they were superior, and they, being the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime, would effectively carry out all orders of their new leader, Wei Feng, to the letter, no matter how brutal or heinous these orders, in fact, were. As the combat that had unfolded in this hellishly devastating pocket of destruction, as it involved the massed artillery strike from the 300 millimeter PHLO3 systems of one firing battery from the PHLO3 battalion, which completely ravaged a massive area, as one of these systems could saturate an area slightly larger than a grid square or a 1 by 1 kilometer area. The devastation in this area was simply unspeakable. It was absolutely savage and hellish. And what remained was effectively nothing but piles of rubble, including even the barely standing remains of the metal fabrication plant brought to the ground by a combination of 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions dropped from a JH-7 strike aircraft, with also the demolition robots being utilized heavily in this sector in order to seize and secure and clear the plant with 0 PLA casualties, for only the loss of 1 of 5 heavily armed quad-legged combat robots from one of the 5 cordoning companies of the PLA combat engineers. Ultimately, there would be some wounded PLA combat engineers in this operation, but they would have, in this instance, 0 KIAs, even as the last resistors of the armed reactionary civilians fled into the final city block wherein they tried to make their last stand. They were already dangerously low on ammunition, with many of them having very few, if any, rounds remaining, as in not even full magazines for many of their rifles or handguns, and those that decided to wield shotguns, very few remaining shells. And this because, again, they had no logistical system and they could only carry what they could effectively handle on their person, and they had found that they expended ammunition exceedingly fast in real-life combat, and thus, without a full logistical resupply network and without any centralized command and control, these forces were effectively ineffective at putting up any type of effective long-term resistance, at least in the beginning, as the armed reactionary civilians were simply reacting to the invaders without planning, without any foresight, without any actionable intel, without any heavy weapons capabilities, without any organization or coordination, and most important of all, without any damn logistics. These forces were destined to fail, and fail spectacularly, and they did. The wise among the armed civilians would bide their time and get organized and effectively build up their arsenals and effectively learn how to cope with their lack of communications or information technology effectively, their lack of AI, as they had none, and their lack of ISR capabilities, which all came together to make modern warfare now what it was, with the immensely heavy firepower of the Sino-Russian coalition forces. As China, the world's largest and most capable drone-producing nation, as well as also, and this was by a massive gulf, as well as also the largest by far ground vehicle-producing nation, as well as ship-producing nation, and even military aircraft-producing nation, simply had the nation of America by their proverbial, well, it could be said that they simply had America's number. it could be put in those terms. So effectively, this grouping of armed reactionary civilians in this area would never materialize into a real threat to the flanks because they had not been given the time or capability to do so, as they were not afforded enough time under the conditions that they were under to coordinate and form any type of command and control system. They were unable to stockpile logistics, including ammunition, food, water, and anything else they could need, as they had no working vehicles in this area. All of them had been smashed in the heavy rocket barrage, as again, there were no technicals other than the ones that had passed through on the highway through the area that had managed somehow by some miracle to even get on the interstate system, as most cars by now were largely abandoned or destroyed. What little continued to function and pass through areas were viciously hunted down by dedicated combat drones, loitering munitions, and in some cases even FPV drones. And also, in some instances, they were even strafed by combat aircraft, such as the twin nose cannon of the 23mm twin nose cannons on the strike aircraft, such as the JH-7s, or even fighter aircraft and others, as, again, the PLA and PLAAF and their allies would do their absolute best to do very little, if any, damage to the highway infrastructures, as it was seen as highly important not only to the occupation that was to follow, but for the economic exploitation operations as well, as this battle was effectively decided before it even begun. The armed reactionary civilians in the southeast Dallas pocket were abruptly smashed, as many other operations were occurring concurrently to this, as in several hours in, after the absolute and total annihilation of the Naval Air Station, what few remaining elements that survived of the 1st of the 124th Cav of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the larger 36th ID that had been securing the area had been in headlong retreat for some time, but because they had stuck to I-820, this had inadvertently saved them as they traveled largely underneath or parallel to the highway, barely getting on it at times. This prevented the PLA or PLAAF from using heavy weapons against these forces until they got far enough away from the interstate system, but they were pursued vigorously by the same armored battalion that had heavily assaulted the Naval Air Station, as well as the same light mechanized infantry battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, as these forces were effectively replaced by other light mechanized infantry battalions moving into the area to seize control of the Meacham International Airport and former Naval Air Station areas. These battalions, after a brief logistical resupply, continued and pursued these forces, as these forces eventually began to break apart as they tried to bunch up in order to continue their communications. They started breaking apart as they got further away from the highway, and this allowed for enough confusion to create enough time for the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion and Armored Battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade, including, again, the Light Infantry Battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, to surround these forces in southwest Fort Worth and destroy them with heavy artillery support from this grouping of artillery battalions. Again, there were another PLL 66 152mm battalion and another PLL 01 battalion, in addition to the other two being in this grouping with the PHL 03 battalion, and of course the two Type 83 multiple launch rocket system battalions, which were again an upgrade on the PHL 81 family of 122mm MLRS systems. The Headquarters and Support Battalion of the 19th Artillery Brigade being present in this area, roughly in between the two pockets of firing battalions. Again, the cordon forces that would envelop these two surviving companies of the 1st of the 124th would have massive support, not just from artillery, but from other assets as well. This will be explored in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion to present these concepts in the next video. More to come.